Today on Think Smart with TMFG, Mike and I are going to be discussing 10 reasons why the banks in Canada are not working in your best interest. Mike, before we get started with that, this podcast is another milestone for us. It is our 300th podcast.
It's a lot of podcasts over the years.
That is a lot of podcasts. So thanks to our audience for listening.
How many years have we been doing this?
Well, I went back. Podcast number 1, which was just called Think Smart with TMFG, was in October 19th in 2018.
Yep.
So we're coming up now to 7 years. We have had 162 downloads of that initial podcast.
Yep.
A lot of those happened after the fact. I think we probably only hit 50 in our first week. But I also looked up what have our most popular podcasts been. Number 105 was the most downloads of all time. 385 downloads of that podcast, and that was called Talking About the Housing Boom.
Yep.
Next up was podcast number 180, Lessons from Nick Murray. Very popular, 334 downloads, so no surprise there. And finally, podcast number 218 in July of 2023, How to Avoid a CRA Audit.
Yep.
Thought that was interesting. Maybe that's something we
attention.
need to focus on, right?
Yep. Well, the housing boom, I think we called it right, because I think we were saying this was getting a bit out of hand, and from the timing of it, it seems to have fixed itself a bit.
It has. So today we're going to talk about the banks. And, that's a pretty bold statement to say that they're not working in your best interest.
It's a big part of Canada.
It is. It's, our biggest company, our biggest publicly traded company is a bank, Royal Bank.
Yeah.
And this isn't specific to any one particular bank. It's a general overall feeling. And I thought I'd start with sort of the biggest reason. Banks charge high fees.
Yep.
And many people feel that banks charge high fees for things like overdrafts, account maintenance, ATM withdrawals, and even using your own funds. So I'll give 2 recent examples. Number 1, I had to send $33,000 to an investment company.
Yep.
So I went in and I had to do a money draft or a wire order, and it cost me $80 basically to do the wire order.
Yep.
Now, we know it doesn't really cost them $80. It's all electronic, but it's a little profit center. The other one that really sort of irked me was we've had a number of team members, 4 team members that have become shareholders in the McClelland Financial Group, which is a great thing. So I had received a check and I had to put that money in the bank. Of course, there was a 5-day hold.
Yep.
What was interesting to me is I'm talking to the teller, I'm putting the checks in, and she says to me, "Do you know where you're investing that money?" So the teller's asking me what I'm doing with that money. I said, "I'm investing it." She said, "Well, you could invest it with us." I said, "Oh, okay." And she said, "There wouldn't be a hold on the funds if you invested them with us." So is the hold real or not real? Is it fake?
What was the hold was supposed to accomplish?
Well, what it does for the bank, they get to earn interest on that money, call it $400,000, for 5 days. And it's not just 5 days, it's 5 business days. So it's actually a whole week.
We found the thing they've done with us is if you go back 5 or several years ago, when we received a check to a client's name, you used to be able to, we deposit all our checks that came in here into a bank account, and then they get vested in their Assante accounts for that person. When we used to get a check, let's say in Jane Doe's name, we could put forward deposit only for Jane Doe and put that check into the bank and have it go into their account. The banks changed that rule, and they made it so the checks have to be made to Assante Capital in this case, rather than being the client's name. What it did was, the reason why that's so powerful is when people sell houses, generally speaking, the checks come in their name. Okay. And the banks force themselves into that transaction by saying, we're no longer going to allow you to take the money from your house sale and invest it straight into your financial advisor. We're not going to have to put a piece in between there where you're going to have to deal with us, and it has to go into savings and clear. So they get a hold of that money for at least several days. And of course, they have all their advisors telling them of all the dreams and that they can make come through from the bank side of things. So again, they're not dumb.
No, they're not.
They make good profits. So, and that's where a lot of it comes from.
Next up, so number 1 was high fees. Number 2 is, call it a lack of transparency. Banks are sometimes criticized for not clearly explaining their fees. So you and I have come across something recently where banks will say that they manage an account for 50 basis points.
Yep.
Well, that's not quite the truth. They manage the next dollar for 50 basis points, but all the existing money isn't managed for 50 basis points. In most cases, it's managed for a much higher rate.
A lot of times it's the first 500,000 is 1.5 up to millions at 1. And if you're over $3 or $4 million, they drop to 50 basis points. But if you do the math on your, let's say, $3 million, if you're at 50 basis points, you should be $15,000 a year in fees. You're not.
I had another interesting example. So a client had a large sum of money, over $800,000, that they had come into their hands from the sale of an investment, and they were going to use it to pay off their debt. So the bank reached out to them and said, well, we'll pay you 5% over 120 days if you invest that money with us. So the first question the client asks is, well, why just 120 days? Well, that's all. The client needed the money in 150 days, not 120, but the bank said, no, we can't do that. We can only do 120 days. So they set the terms of the agreement. Number two, my client understood that they were actually going to get 5% on their $800,000 during that 120 days. They never clarified that they're actually only getting 1.67% because it's only 120 days. The 5% rate is a 12-month rate, not a 3-month rate.
Yep.
But that was never explained to the client. They were basically telling me, no, Rob, they're giving me 5%. 5% times $800,000 is $40,000 for the 120 days that money is invested. That'd be 15% a year. That's not good transparency.
No, not at all.
Next up, profiting from debt. This is a tough one, but if you go on to your bank website, if you log in, they are promoting you to take on debt. Now, it's interesting because we all know that financially debt is bad.
Yep.
We're financial advisors. If we see a client with a lot of debt or building up debt, we're telling them not to build up debt. And yet we have our financial institutions that are providing advice at the same time recommending taking on more debt. Here's a new credit card. Add your line of credit, whatever you want. And they're promoting it on their website. At the same time, they're saying we're offering financial advice and we're doing our fiduciary responsibility of providing advice.
Yep.
So let's look at this. On one hand, they say they're providing financial advice. They wanted to provide financial advice on the money that I had sitting in my bank account. At the same time, they're promoting credit cards with high interest rates. I mean, think of a typical credit card. It's got interest rates of 18 to 25%. They're trying to promote people getting into a cycle of ongoing debt.
Yep.
Are you providing advice or are you trying to sell credit cards? You can't be doing both because they're completely different. Let's go back to the financial crisis. Mike, what happened in the U.S. with all the banks?
Well, 2008, well, it was before 2008, 2007, the banks always see an advantage when they have problems come up. Now we call it subprime mortgage crisis. And back in 2007, there was the government was pushing for people to get mortgages, and they kept on pushing debt on people. They relaxed the rules enough where anyone could get a mortgage. They didn't really check the value of the property. They didn't really check your income. Basically, they were joking that your dog could get a mortgage at that time. So they were just giving away mortgages because what they would do is rather be responsible for the mortgages individually, where they're really concerned about the person who's taking out the mortgage, they began to put them in these pools of mortgages. And by putting them in a pool of mortgage, they could reduce the volatility in it because you weren't worried about everyone wasn't going to default at the same time. So if you have 30 mortgages, there's a lot less risk than one mortgage. So they created these subprime mortgage pools for people to go, or we call them tranches, I guess was the term back then. And people would invest into these subprime mortgage pools. And they get a decent return off those because they were a little bit higher than the average interest rates. And the banks were saying they were very safe. But what no one realized was how far they pushed the rules of lending and how much the properties were actually worth that were backing these mortgages and how unstable the income was of the people who were taking out these mortgages. And they went and put the problem onto the investors who were buying these subprime mortgage funds. So when they went down, the banks almost washed their hands of it.
So in Canada, it was a little different. We didn't have the full crisis, but we did have subprime mortgages. What the government of Canada did was a little bit different. they actually took those mortgages off the bank's books and put them on their own.
Yeah.
So that the banks could get through the crisis. And it worked because there was never a run on the bank. None of the banks went bankrupt. The truth is those mortgages still happened, and they were still pushed on Canadian investors and U.S. investors by our banks.
We were close. We'll give credit to Paul Martin back then. The banks wanted to go and combine themselves together at a certain point in time to go and compete with the U.S. on the subprime mortgage level. And Paul Martin at that time, he might have been finance minister before he was prime minister, but put kibosh the idea of having the banks blend together. He said we have to keep them separate because banks are already big enough in Canada. Last thing you need is just one bank. I mean, that's
right.
going to be a totally monopoly. So that helped us get through the subprime mortgage crisis, and we didn't take as much of a hit as the U.S.
So next up is corporate greed. And this one's always a tough one, but I think that people they know the banks are profit machines. And yet if you ask a lot of investors who have their money with the banks, they say they pay no fees.
Yep.
And I always say, well, how did they happen to make $3 billion the last quarter? And the client is always a little dumbfounded when I ask them that. Recent headline, the head of RBC, I think his pay last year with bonuses was $28 million. And yet we hear that, we're struggling as a country and our GDP, there's a lot going on, and yet the top guy at the top bank is able to walk away with $28 million in a year. Way back when, and it's changed, but it's still out there a little bit. There used to be a broker philosophy, and it was, well, the bank made money, I made money,
Yep.
2 out of 3 isn't bad.
Yeah.
And I think that's corporate greed still falls in. As long as the bank is making their profits.
Well, Canada's such an unusual place because the government protects the banks, right? We have limited access from foreign banks in Canada. It's part of the rules and the charter. I don't know if it's in the charter, but part of the rules of Canada is very difficult for foreign banks to take a hold in Canada. And
Donald Trump's been saying that.
Yeah, and that goes and puts a limitation to competition. And you have this monopoly. We don't have a monopoly with one, but we have a monopoly with 5, let's say, that own the banking market. And it's very difficult for anyone to get in there. And the other thing is, I won't say there's collusion, but it seems that all the fees seem to be very much move in time with each other. It doesn't seem like anyone's trying to undercut anyone on fees and try to get a strategic advantage. Well, usually when you see companies in competition with each other, they'll be trying to undercut the other one. The banks very rarely ever try to undercut each other. They have their level of fees that they consider acceptable, and there's no one else here to compete with them.
It's kind of like a salary cap or something in sports. It's just everyone's playing in the same level
plays on
field.
The same level. You don't change it.
No one's going to offer 6% on your GIC.
Yep.
Because all the other banks would have some backlash against that. That's interesting. Okay, next up, unfair lending practices. Here's the basic problem, is the banks are there when you really don't need them. When your financial situation is in great order, it's easy to borrow money. When you're struggling even a little bit, as a business, as a property owner, whatever the case may be, maybe you lost your job, they're not great at supporting you. Yeah. They're just as quick to foreclose on that mortgage that you have or call in that line of credit when they know you're struggling a little bit.
And there's laws out there against tied selling, but they don't obey the laws. And you've even experienced that when you were going to consolidate some debt. I remember you said you went to consolidate debt and they wouldn't do it unless you moved your financial accounts over.
Plain and simple. I told them I can't move my financial accounts over. We don't want you as a client. Hold it. With my income level and my net worth, you don't want me as a client? No.
Yeah.
You got to have the money here so we can manage it.
Again, there's the corporate greed. They want everything.
We've seen some consolidation. I think probably the most recent one is the HSBC. Their Canadian operation was purchased by our biggest bank, which made them only bigger.
Yep.
I don't think that's a good thing. I don't think it's a good thing when the most valuable company in your country is a bank and their top 10 most valuable are all banks. I just don't think that speaks well.
Remember, ING used to be the competition. What's ING now? ING went to Tangerine and now is bought by one of the big five.
By Scotiabank.
Yeah.
Owned by Scotiabank.
So again, as you see the competition comes in, it doesn't seem they like competition. They'd rather buy them and they find them a way to make more profitable. And they find a way to make more money on that. ING was phenomenally competitive in cash savings. And there's no one in that marketplace now. Now that they're gone, no one plays in that field
No one's
anymore.
going after that. Maybe Wealthsimple, Questrade, some of them are attempting to go after it a little bit, but not quite. Next up is conflicts of interest. People are often suspicious when banks have both roles. Advisor, banker. Advisor, banker. Tough to do. Like, think of the simple game of Monopoly. You have a banker. Typically, when you appoint someone the banker, they're normally pretty good at math because you got to exchange money. And typically, they're trustworthy. You don't expect them to be pulling the $500 bills out of the $500 pile.
Yep.
I think it's difficult for banks to be on both sides. And as we've talked about in previous podcasts, there used to be walls in between. There are no walls. Now, for us, we don't provide the banking. If we do, it's a third party.
Yep.
We recommend a third party for most of what we do.
Well, even from the financial advice side, whenever you go to see any type of bank-related firms for advice, their first choice will put you into a bank-related product. And we've seen that conflict of interest before, and it's hard to believe that people don't have to really go and people don't understand the conflict they're in, because it's very difficult when you're with a company to go and pull people out of your own product, even if they're underperforming. So if you're with one of the banks, you're in their product, and they start to underperform, do you think they're really going to recommend another bank's product?
Well, it will be within their product lineup.
Yeah.
It'll just be another fund.
Yeah.
But is that the right fiduciary responsibility that you have for your client? I don't think it is. So number 9 was using their own products. Number 10 is really accessing personal information. So this one I thought was interesting. So my wife Ingrid received a phone call the other night, 8 o'clock, and the person on the phone said they're calling from Bank of Montreal. My wife couldn't understand exactly what they're saying, but what they basically told her is that I see that you have $10,000 sitting in your bank account. Would you like to invest that money? Mike, I don't know. There's a privacy break there.
Yeah.
You shouldn't be able to have someone, get in, look at my bank. I know people know in my branch, I know there's people that know how much is in our accounts or how much is on our line of credit. I expect that. The same happens in our office.
Yep.
But I don't expect them to use that information to grow their business. They're not trying to help my wife.
Yep.
They're trying to get that money invested at a higher interest rate.
Yep.
They're trying to get it invested long term.
Yep.
And I just don't think that's right. It's a conflict of interest. They're accessing personal information.
Yep.
We've got all these rules and regulations about personal information, and yet banks are able to access your personal information for their marketing. That's not right. We've covered a lot. I'm not saying that all banks and all advisors aren't acting in your best interest, but overall, there's a growing sense in Canada that they're not acting in your best interest. That brings us to the end of another week. This is Rob and Mike with Think Smart from the McClelland Financial Group of Assante Capital Management.